So today's talk is by Timm, Chief Curator, Maine Maritime Museum, with a curious title from my point of view. I haven't seen the presentation, so I don't know. But the princes, ship-owning princes. Who are these princes and what does that term exactly mean? Anyway, Chris is here to present it. Chris, take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much first to Robin and Peter for inviting me, for you all for coming out on a very cold winter morning. And I know there's a little promise of getting us out here on time. My wife is due 1 week from today. I have the car, so we're all on the same page here of being rather succinct with our goal here today. So thank you so much for everyone for having me today. So I'd like us all to picture one of Bath's ship owners or say a sea captain. Who do you imagine? Do you imagine someone like this individual here, Captain Youngren and his daughter aboard the Sewell vessel Oriental? So someone, dressed with kind of a somewhat salty austerity, kind of a no-nonsense kind of appearance, and then someone who brings their home to sea, in the case of his adorable young daughter here at the bottom, kind of bedecked in fall-weather gear. Do we equally think of this image, though? Ella Schofield and Captain James Schofield, kind of dressed to the nines in fur and their finery, kind of against a backdrop of this kind of like Spanish Moroccan architecture, and a little bit of nod to, kind of more the opposite, bringing the sea to home with this kind of reminder of with this sextant right here. And this kind of multiple personas, if you will, of Bath's mariners is something I've been thinking quite a bit about the last few months. When I came across this entry in the Independent Junior in 1885, talking about the Cedars, a homestead of the Houghtons that we'll talk a little bit more about later today, talking about the fine home that they have and how it is the residence of the shipping city's ship-owning princes. Now, already we've had a bit of skepticism voiced to princes. Come on. I mean, who do they think they are? So, I think that's the question that I'd like us all to consider today is, okay, ship-owning princes. Does that mean anything at all? Is there something here, at least, that we should, is worth our time considering just a little bit? Because when they say, when the Independent Junior uses a term like that, there's actually a long history of this sort of terminology. It goes back to, and I'm sorry, I should add that Arthur Sewell also in his time was called the Maritime Prince. So this is kind of not a one-off verbiage that we're using in this case. And the idea of a merchant prince has a long history. This is not kind of something that, I'm sorry to say, the Independent Junior came up with on its own. It's really the idea that of a person involved in trade whose wealth conveys cultural and political influence. And that's kind of something that I think we'll keep coming back to today. This kind of rose during the Northern Renaissance when we have all of a sudden in the Low Countries these maritime merchants all of a sudden making vast quantities of money. They're commissioning art. They're holding political offices because of that. And that's kind of an long established historical narrative that, well, this happens over there. Why can't that also be happening here to a certain extent? And that's what we'll be looking at today. Obviously, coming from Maine Maritime Museum, I'm going to be talking a lot about kind of some of the things and sharing with you all some of the things in our collection that can kind of maybe shed a little bit of light on this issue, this idea of the prince in terms of cultural and political influence. So that's kind of the two sections of my talk today. So let's start with cultural. I'm sure it comes to no news to all of you in this room that in the 19th century, Bath ships and their captains and crews were traveling the globe. That there was a global network that Bath was interwoven with and intertwined with. And so one of the things that we're going to kind of look a little bit at first is, okay, what are some signs of that's actually happening? I mean, we have the stories. What are some actual like physical, tangible things that came about from this? And we won't start quite at prince level yet, because I mean, I'm sure we have a few princes in the audience. But if you're like me, you're not going to necessarily start off with acquiring the things that would be maybe characteristic of a prince. You might be starting off with things like this. These are sailors' valentines. And I guess we should also say kind of so-called sailors' valentines, because essentially the idea is that it's this shell art that would be brought back to a wife, a sweetheart, by a sailor in this case. Now, we do know for a fact that while some of these were made by sailors for their sweethearts, often they were simply just picked up at kind of tchotchke shops all around the Caribbean. Places like this, Belgrave's New Curiosity Shop. So, I'm sure, this is the day after Valentine's. I'm sure some of us made beautiful handmade Valentines for our significant others. Some of us were at Shaw's the other day at lunchtime, quickly picking up something in this case. And guess what? Some things never change, right? And so we actually have an interior shot, sorry that's 90 degrees here, giving you all a little neck workout at the beginning. This is actually the interior of the New Curiosity Shop. If anyone's kind of familiar with Perry's Nut House, that's kind of always what I think of when I see this interior shot. You have the kind of shark jaws, you have, all the kind of like exotic animals that you could kind of have stuffed, taxidermied, and then bring home. But we also know that the New Curiosity Shop was pumping out these kind of octagonal sailors' valentines as well to bring back. If you were maybe going a little bit further than kind of showing, okay, here's a keepsake from my different global voyages, you might actually end up coming home with one of these, a ship portrait. These were executed by what are called port painters, and the general idea here is that they're sometimes kind of somewhat disdainfully described as like literally waiting at the end of the pier, just waiting for someone to come in that would commission a work of art from them, and they would just kind of quick put it together. So they're also called pierhead painters sometimes for that kind of quick turnaround time. And you can see, just looking at kind of two examples that we have here from the museum, there's kind of a lot of, I guess we could say, variables and constants going on here. There's variables in the sense of kind of, how the rigging is defined, a few particulars of the vessel, but there's kind of also a constant here. And there's many other examples that I could show of scenes of where a vessel is entering Le Havre in France, and the composition is more or less the same, the setting is the same. And I think that's actually kind of important rather than just something to kind of discount. I mean, the fact that all of these kind of needed to have some sort of, or at least in these particular examples, kind of topographic sign, it's a kind of almost, it strengthens the collection rather than you can actually show, well, yeah, this is actually this vessel that either was the master of or was aboard or owned, traveled to this specific place, and then kind of you fill in the blanks after that. And so a lot of our collection, you could kind of look through that lens, that yes, you have multiple paintings of one vessel. Some of them might be at Le Havre. Some of them might be in Italy, entering the port of Genoa with kind of the characteristic lighthouse lantern here. Maybe you have a few off the coast, the beautiful coast of England, showing that you traveled there. And then this particular example, which is in a private collection, is the Bath Houghton vessel at the harbor of Livorno, or Leghorn, as it was rather kind of inelegantly described by English speakers at the time. And so, here we are. We're in this beautiful Mediterranean setting, and right there, Houghton, Bath, right on the vessel and right at the center of the composition here. So really, it's all about this particular vessel, but it's also about the scenery that surrounds it. All the attention is not only on the vessel, although the vessel gets pride of place. There's all this bustling activity being shown in this harbor scene as well. So kind of as a whole, the idea of these ship portraits as kind of conveying the global reach of a master, of a shipbuilder, I think is a really important thing for us to kind of view them in their entirety here. Because this interest in what is happening globally was something that in Bath was key. This was part of the kind of everyday business of the people that lived in this town. This is kind of, this image shows a little bit of how that scope is broadening in the 19th century. So we actually have, let's see, in French it's a lake and village in Cochin Chine, which was at the time the term for Vietnam. Because Westerners didn't quite understand the geography. They knew there was kind of an area called Cochin, which was north of Saigon, and it was kind of around China. So it wasn't China, it was Cochin, China. So that's kind of how that was the term for Vietnam at the time. You'll notice that, we have this kind of beautiful, hand-colored engraving here. Notice this is kind of odd, what's going on at the top here. Can anyone kind of read that? What's the challenge here? It's backwards, right? And I'll confess, I first saw things like this a few years ago, and my first, when you see it the first time, you're like, oh, is there some sort of printing error here? Actually, like printing plates often would be, like you would make a copy of them and then be, doing kind of copies on the side if you were kind of a black market publisher. So, and then you wouldn't necessarily make the, that transfer basically flips the image. So at first I kind of thought, well, okay, there's something going on here with that. It's not actually, which is interesting. The clue here is view dope deek at the bottom. Now to really actually see this image, we're seeing it in front of us. In order to truly understand this image, we need a zogroscope. So who has a zogroscope in the audience that I could borrow just for a minute? Okay, well, it kind of looks like one of these, so if you ever come across one of them, please, bring them to one of these next lectures or something, so you'll be ready. It's this kind of mirror and convex glass setup that when one of these is placed below it, there's actually a kind of a 45-degree mirror behind this convex. So basically the image comes up, hits that 45-degree mirror, so that's why part of the text is flipped. And then you get this kind of convex, like, it's almost like early VR, if you will, in terms of how people thought these images came alive, because it basically is kind of making the image much more immersive. So as you actually kind of shift a little bit as you're looking at it, it actually seems like you're kind of looking at this three-dimensional image, at least for the audience at the time. This was really kind of something new going on here. So these kind of images these engraved images were kind of an important part of kind of, these would be collected, and then you would say in your parlor in Bath, you'd be able to show all these particular exotic scenes that you either maybe have been or would love to go at the same time. So again, it's kind of that global reach. And I did kind of allude to this at the beginning of talking about that image, that in the 19th century, Asia is really opening up to Bath merchant vessels at this time. So you kind of see a list of, as the ports kind of open up for trade, a lot of this is happening, in the 1840s for China, but then notably the Yokohama port opens in 1859. So there was kind of a massive interest in these kind of Chinese and Japanese goods during this period. And we have a lot of things like this, things that you're probably familiar with. Blueware coming from China. This actually is, I kind of include this because I love that this is actually British knockoff of Chinese porcelain. So in terms of kind of how globalism kind of reverberates throughout different decades, that's what's going on here. And then you also have things like this, a completely different like level of this can be nicely slid in. You could bring maybe a crate of this home. These are really large vases. They're over they're about 3 feet tall. And these particular ones were collected by William D. Sewell, and were kind of valued, and they actually appear in kind of successive Sewell generation photos as kind of key decor in their houses as well. So 2 of them, and just really kind of massive and completely, obviously, this is ceramic, but it's decorative ceramic. This is not something that you're actually using. These are just gigantic and really vibrant and colorful. I mean, that's kind of, they make this massive visual impact. There's also smaller examples being brought back. This is a Chinese hairpin that was owned by Jane Houghton. And you can see, I'll zoom in here so we can kind of see the delicate decoration going on the with this kind of dragon-like motif. This is ivory, so very expensive material. Gold paint applied, and then this kind of lacquer uniting the whole piece. So this was something that we know that Jane Houghton would wear out to nice evenings. And again, it's just this one little subtle indication of the kind of, again, the global scope of the objects and the travel that these families represent. A more kind of literal representation of that would be this here, this amazing image. Actually brought back by Captain Gibbons, Mary Frances Gibbons, I believe his daughter, and it was actually acquired in Japan from like photographs of these 3 ladies that he brought, and then asked a Japanese artist to show these Westerners all dressed up in this kind of exotic Japanese garb in this case. So that, this is a very kind of visible, like almost dress up, if you will, of showing this global reach that these kind of trade networks had. This is kind of another, so going off of that, so I'm showing you this steam yacht Juneau, which was, obviously just in of itself a statement of status and a luxury by the Houghton family that owned it. But I was looking at an interior shot of the vessel the other day, and you can see, beautiful paneling, really nicely kind of laid out. But then there's this image in the back right, which really kind of pairs well with that image I showed you a moment ago. But this one is actually a photograph. You can see how there's almost kind of like the Schofield, where they're in front of this kind of Spanish Moroccan architecture. We actually have this kind of orientalizing motif back here. It's a photo studio, obviously, instead of cowboy dress up here in this case, we have members of the family actually putting on these kimonos and taking photographs on this. So there's this is prevalent in a lot of different sectors of society at this point. Also, speaking of dress up, is this marble bust that we have in our collection of William Dunning Sewell. Now, I mean, sometimes we just have to back up and kind of state the obvious. William Dunning Sewell was not known for walking around Bath with a toga. This does not show him in his traditional dress. So, like, sometimes we're so like accustomed, like, oh yeah, I've seen things like that before. You kind of gloss over the obvious point here. It's like, well, no, I mean, this is a complete fabrication that we're seeing here. There's a point to this being made, and one of the points is that the Sewell family commissioned actually a Bath born artist by John Adams Jackson, who had gone abroad and studied in elite places like Rome and Florence the proper European art of classical and neoclassical sculpture. So there's this nice connection to Bath on a global scale, both in terms of the patron who's purchasing this, but then the artist as well. And we have great kind of a little bit of back and forth that I couldn't resist to include of the artist in this case in 1874, basically writing, it was actually to Arthur Sewell, and saying the marble bust, you're so delighted to know is actually in the mail. Presumably it would be, months before they would actually receive it. And then kind of at the bottom, he kind of drops this really not very subtle and maybe not, completely alien to artists plea for, well, I'm kind of a little hard up on money right now, by the way. I think you owe me a little bit more for this. I've been doing all these commissions for Americans, and they haven't really been good at paying me for them. All the best. So there's that component, which is great. But then the amazing thing is, a year later, he actually writes, and the tables have turned. He's basically writing E&A Sewell, you'll notice. I enclose a check for basically my shares in one of your vessels that I've invested in. So he's actually now owing the Sewells some money because they somehow turned, I'd love to know the sequence of events here, but they somehow turned an art commission into a new shareholder at the same time, which is great. And I don't want to dwell too much on this, but one thing that to me personally I'm struck by is just, if you kind of notice this detail, is this exactly like an idealized representation? Often you think of like idealized classical statue, everyone just kind of looks photoshopped and beautiful. Is that exactly what's going on here? No, I mean, we have rather kind of sunken eyes. We have all these wrinkles going on. We have these almost like pot-marked dimples. Often these things would be, say, if they existed in the actual individual, it might be kind of not addressed in the sculpture. But John Adams Jackson, again, I should come back to, was kind of like an Italian classically trained sculptor, and he was very familiar with a kind of a trend in classical Roman sculpture, which was called veritas, which basically just means truth, exactly. And it's through this truth, and actually, we kind of know that there was actually like photoshopping in the other way. So that rather than softening all these wrinkles, you would play up the pot marks, the wrinkles, the furrowed brow, because it shows, and we have a lot of writings from the Roman period knowing this, that it shows like conviction and experience. You have seen it, you have lived it, you are salty, if you will, and from living these things. So, there's interesting things that are going on here. And I have to note that, talking at Patton, obviously there's this wonderful bust also by the artist of John Patton, which again kind of takes a little different approach. So there's kind of different styles, I would suggest, that Jackson is kind of working within. So then let's turn to the Independent Junior again. We got to return kind of back to where we started. This fine home of the Cedars, which was on Washington Street. This kind of the ground zero, if we will, for our Prince's discussion. So the Cedars was a Houghton house at 590 Washington Street, torn down, I believe, in the 1940s. It's more or less where the soup chip offices are today. So you're looking at the exterior here. And the thing that I kind of want to go in a little more detail about that Independent Junior article is it's amazing not only for kind of provoking, I guess, this discussion of princes today, but it has like an entire listing of, well, okay, how was this house furnished? What was it decorated with? And actually goes into almost like an inventory of what's in the Houghton house in this case. And so you can see one of the things that it highlights is at the carriage house, there was a gilded figurehead of the brig Clarissa Ann, which is in our collection today as well. So, this kind of very visible representation of the proud shipbuilding and seafaring legacy of the Houghton family. If we have interior shots of it as well, which is amazing to take a look at. You can see, the lavish wallpaper and decor throughout all the different spaces. A lot of these paintings are identified in that Independent Junior article as well. And as you know, wallpaper everywhere And we're also very fortunate in our archives to have samples that were preserved of the wallpaper here. This beautiful kind of geometric pattern. And I love this one where, you have the honeycomb kind of as this geometric background, but then it's filled in with all these kind of bees working on the wallpaper. Beautiful, beautiful things. There also were kind of these, what I guess we could say kind of like orientalizing Chinese-inspired designs in this particular crane. I actually looked at the kind of details. We have samples of this as well. It actually was, again, kind of thinking about the global connections here at this time. This was Chinese-style paper produced in France and then ending up in Bath at the time. So, I mean, again, that just kind of speaks to all these connections. I had to, indulge me for 1 second. This is an anonymous Washington Street house where I live. And it just, it shows as we were painting, and actually taking off layers and layers of paint, lo and behold, what do we find? All this kind of this bamboo style wallpaper underneath all these other there's a little bit of the kind of, your 20th century rose wallpaper there. But it just shows that this was, our house's story is much more modest compared to some of the other houses that we're looking at. But still, this kind of, these exotic wallpapers were in vogue and depicted everywhere. It kind of, if you will, forgive the kind of comparison, it kind of trickled down from the elites to everywhere throughout Bath, these trendsetters. We also have descriptions of particular ship portraits, the Caledonia and then the Clarissa Ann. Both paintings you're actually looking at right here from our collection, so we know that those were held were at the Houghton homestead when the Independent Junior was writing about. And then there's also just to get a little sense of the tone. And obviously, it's this is a newspaper, so it's a little over the top. But you can read how how kind of prized this collection was, how the most of which would be prized in any gallery of art in our land. And then there's this long running list of all the paintings that were in these spaces. Here's a shot of the dining room, and thankfully kind of reconciling that article with some things also in our collection, we can actually kind of identify everything that we see in this photograph, which is great. There was and I should stress, after Rembrandt, so basically a copy of Rembrandt's self-portrait, which is recorded in the Independent Junior, a representation, a ship portrait of the Pocahontas, which we now have in Maine Maritime Museum's collection, and then this portrait called Bubbles of a young lady blowing bubbles in this kind of little saucer, or almost like a taza there in the top right. And that wasn't, that's a particularly well documented house that we have in Bath. This is 838 Washington, another Houghton house. And I just wanted to point out this curio cabinet that we have pictured a photograph of here. And I was looking at this a little bit because it would be great to kind of get a little sense of what some of the things we're looking at in this case, because essentially this is kind of, your higher end like tchotchkes that you've gathered through your travels would be represented in a curio cabinet. And this particular statue caught my attention just because I felt like that one we might be able to identify. It just was particularly individualized. And lo and behold, after a little bit of search, it's actually after a classical sculpture at the Louvre, the Diana of Gabi, which was then shrunk down to make these kind of grand tour sculptures. Maybe some of you are familiar with that kind of genre in the 19th century, by a particular foundry in Paris. That is actually what we're looking at right here. And so I actually then ducked around and looked a little bit for, was anyone around in Paris to pick these sorts of, who would be the player in this case that would actually maybe pick this item up? And we actually have a diary by Amory Houghton I of a trip to the World's Fair in Vienna in 1873, but he stopped at all these different places around Europe, basically the Grand Tour at the time, and was really struck by the Louvre. He actually writes about going there multiple times. Doesn't nail it down, but it's probably our most likely culprit here in this particular case. So it's wonderful to be able to kind of link these layers of meaning together. Now we should say we've looked at a lot of princely things that some people would kind of frown upon as not being particularly sailorly. And we do have, admittedly, some examples of people being a little bit more no-nonsense when it comes to decor. There's a very oft-repeated line, or I guess kind of episode, if you will, of what happened when Arthur Sewell discovered a beautiful black walnut cabinet aboard the Indiana. And you can see that he kind of rather loudly pronounced that we do not allow such ornaments on Sewell ships. We do not intend our captains to be reading storybooks at sea. We intend our captains to spend their time on deck reading the weather and trying to make quick passages. So, I mean, there's a lot of thing, yeah, exactly. And whether or not this survived, maybe this is the reason why we don't have this particular object in our collection. And there's some degrees of this is a little bit of a kind of a story of a story. So exactly how much did it actually reflect the actual character of that exchange? But I should note, I mean, not to I guess call out any sort of contradiction here, but that may have been an attitude aboard the vessel. But at home, Arthur Sewell may have had a slightly different outlook. So he was not necessarily a stranger to maybe some of the finer things at home. It was more that the image of a Sewell vessel as a no-nonsense vessel was kind of an important one to withhold in this case. And so that's where I would actually like to kind of pivot our conversation away from kind of the cultural exchange and the cultural capital, if you will, of these families, and to the political one. And obviously Arthur Sewell would be a great candidate for that, because we're going to turn to 1896 now, the Democratic National Convention. And as I'm sure most of you are familiar with, at that convention, Arthur Sewell was named as the vice presidential candidate of the Democratic Party. We have a lot of great things related to that in our collections. We actually have his acceptance speech that he delivered, as well as the draft of the acceptance speech, which is really interesting to see his corrections and kind of changes as he's getting ready to deliver this. He is definitely a fan of kind of simplifying the language. Anything that was kind of a little bit too flowery just gets kind of corrected into a much more just simple, direct speak. And his major platform, if you actually read a little bit of this and come down, you can see that he talks about that the kind of main campaign item is the existing monetary system. So it's not exactly maybe the most sensational or inspirational thing to our perspectives, but this was actually a really debated topic at the time, whether or not the gold standard should be maintained or whether silver should come into the conversation as well. Basically, there were two different camps. If you wanted inflation, you had one opinion. If you didn't want a deflation, you had a different opinion. So it really kind of fractured the country at that time. But this kind of image of like the silver savior, if you will, was really embraced by that campaign. We have the Bryan, who was the head of the ticket as the presidential nominee, the campaign songster that had the battle cry of silver, which you can see how it's talking about kind of the swell, the tide of silver sweeping the nation across the shore. So there's a little bit of kind of maritime imagery going on with Arthur Sewell at the kind of Veep spot, if you will. Does anyone can read music right off the? Would anyone like to give a rendition of the battle cry of silver? Well, maybe later. And obviously, nationally, there was a lot of interest in who is this Arthur Sewell, because he was kind of a candidate a little bit out of left field. So I love this kind of almost like a baseball card stat of Sewell in a nutshell, with all these kind of great temperament, active and aggressive, manner, energetic. Father's occupation, shipbuilder, thank you very much. Early influence, brought up in a shipyard. Like early characteristics, fond of work and railroad scheming. So it's always good to find another kindred spirit. And favorite subject, silver. So kind of just distilling that campaign down to a single word there. And then, that's quite funny too. And so the other thing was kind of, there was a lot of conversation about, okay, well, why this fellow? Why Arthur Sewell? What kind of importance does he have? And this is from the Philadelphia Times. And you can see the kind of the first section, it basically is saying how he has a connection to Philadelphia, even though he's from Maine, because his shipping interests are intertwined with that city's interests as well. So it's showing just Bath's kind of national role in the conversation as well. It's kind of praising him for being singular among shipbuilders in that his yard at Bath builds vessels only for his own use and ownership, and today he can proudly say he owns 1/10 of all the full rig ships that fly the American flag, not schooners, brigs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the asterisks to that statement. So, I mean, there's kind of this shipbuilder and this kind of maritime connection resonates across the country in some of these editorials. But also, I mean, for all the kind of austere image, there's a lot of things written about his home after he's named the vice presidential candidate as well. It's talking about how really there's sparing no expense to his house, which is almost the exact kind of opposite of the discussion that we had earlier in terms of these kind of frivolous things in a ship's cabin. We have some great kind of obviously after he was proclaimed the vice presidential candidate, we have all of a sudden these kind of suppliers of campaign goods kind of pestering him, talking about here are all the different ways to present your image at a national perspective. Often it involves kind of over-the-top regalia and fancy costumes for the different Democratic clubs to wear while they're marching for him. But despite all this kind of energy and attention towards his candidacy, November 3rd, 1896 rolls around, and he and Bryan are defeated in the election. There's this fantastic artifact that we have in our library that kind of at first glance looks like a ship voyage expedition broadsheet. So it's talking about how the old ship Democracy sailed from Port Chicago, July 7th, 1896. So that was the date of the Democratic National Convention. So, okay, right away we're seeing, okay, there's some connections here. Who's the captain? Well, Jennings Bryan. Who's the first mate? Arthur Sewell. Okay. Who's the second mate? Tom Watson. That's kind of actually like a rather political joke at the time, because he was, there was a different party that nominated Bryan as their presidential candidate. So he was running on basically two parties, but then they nominated someone else other than Arthur Sewell as the vice presidential candidate. So that would be the second mate in this case. And then I love this, trip stormy, landed 6 million passengers, that was the number of votes they received, without loss of life at Camp Cold Comfort headwaters of Salt River, and we'll get into that in a second. Colony now settled for 4 years, barring accidents. And then there's all these kind of songs that are going to be played. Clearly this was in Iowa, this kind of like Republican-leaning kind of celebratory meeting at the, basically this kind of celebration for their victory. So clearly kind of what was kind of originally his strength in terms of the national conversation, this kind of maritime background, clearly quickly becomes lampoons as kind of a way to kind of politically skewer them after they lose by kind of these sorts of images. There's also this one, which is great, done by, this is from the Boston Public Library, by a kind of a fairly well-known advertiser there who kind of just worked up this little mock-up Salt River Packet Company with a connection with the boat Arthur Sewell. And is anyone familiar with the term Salt River? In the 19th century, to kind of go up Salt River was just kind of a euphemism for like being just completely defeated. So there's this kind of playing on this like packet going up Salt River, that we have this great little kind of note here that as you are expected to not to return, checks will be issued for unlimited baggage for everyone. So, that kind of resonates very well today as well, right? Airline travel. You can check all the bags you want because we're not coming back from Salt River. So again, kind of playing off of that, that maritime advantage became something to kind of, use in his skewering afterwards. So I gave us a kind of a little bit of an overview of cultural and some of the political connections here. And just kind of by way of concluding, I wanted to have kind of one coda to some of the things that we talked about today. And that's actually to look at, briefly at, Arthur Sewell's son, Harold, who was political like his father. There's a whole story there that we could get into. But we have the speech that he gave at the launching of the Harbour defense ram Katahdin at Bath Iron Works, where he talks about basically how the importance, I'll read this here. I challenge sorry, I can't quite read it. Thank you, Patriots. I'll just let you read it, clearly. You don't need me for this part. But basically just saying how everyone would celebrate the rise of American shipping and lament its fall. So he's really interweaving the national fate with the fate of the maritime industries in this case. This is a rather lengthy speech. It goes on for many pages, so again, kind of showing his political aspirations. Sorry for this horrible joke. The speech was probably longer than the Harbour Defense Ram Katahdin's service history, for those of you who know what happened in the end here. But clearly, positioning his family as kind of the, shipbuilding and the national stability as kind of this interwoven item. If we were to look at the Sewell House at 963 Washington, we would see ship portraits, once again, like we looked at earlier in this lecture. We would see the sculpture of William Dunning Sewell proudly displayed up here as well. And then we also should talk about an important figure, Harold's wife, Camilla, who we're seeing a fabulous painting of here by Hubert Voss. Because Harold was dispatched as minister to Hawaii during the 1890s. And it was when he and Camilla were there that she was painted by Hubert Voss, who just so happens to be the crown painter to the Dutch royal family. So, I mean, this is not just getting any old artist off the street to paint this painting. This is a really influential painter painting the who's who of globally at this time, because I should note that he painted this portrait of her, and then he went on to paint the King of Korea, just in terms of putting her in association with these figures as well. And she was very influential in Hawaii's annexation by the United States, which we're seeing here. Harold Sewell was kind of integral to this annexation of Hawaii as a territory of the United States and bringing it in, and then also, which basically superseded the Queen of Hawaii, who you're seeing here, Lili Ukalani, to basically not take power again. So in conclusion, I would say, well, when you're looking at a cultural, trade network represented by paintings gathered across the entire globe, when you're looking at some of these people ascending to some of the highest political offices in the land, when you see paintings being commissioned by royal painters to other royal families, and when you're actually receiving the abdication of a queen, I think we could forgive the independent junior for going a little bit so far to say there's a little bit of princely attitude going on here in Bath. So I'd like to thank you all for your attention and your time today, and I'm happy to take any questions.